Hi, my name's Ollie, and in this Politics Explained video, I'm going to go through everything you need to know about conservatism in A-level politics. I'm going to first look at the development of conservatism over time, from traditional conservatism to one-nation conservatism to the new right. I'm then going to look at the key principles and agreements within conservatism, as well as the key tensions and disagreements, in particular between the strands. And then finally, I'm going to look at the key thinkers you need to know for your politics A-level in relation to conservatism. The PDF you can see on your screen, you can find by going in the first link in the description to the Politics Explained website, where you can also find lots of resources to help you in your politics A-level, including updated textbooks and essay plans, which can really help you achieve those top grades. So yeah, let me know if you've got any questions or comments in the comment section below, and without further ado, let's get into it. So, starting off, this particular video, or this first part of the video, is going to look at the strands of conservatism, and effectively its development over the time. So starting with the emergence of conservatism, as I said, traditional, one nation, and the new right. What I've got first is some of the key essay questions you need to know when answering the conservatism questions, and this is for the whole of the conservatism topic. So you've got these broad ones in terms of to what extent do conservatives agree, which is also a very broad question. And you could also potentially get questions that highlight two particular strands and ask you to kind of consider the agreements and disagreements within them. You'll notice that all of these questions focus on the extent to which there is agreement within the strands. So you're really comparing agreements versus disagreements, and you're being asked to come up with a judgment on which is more important. So yes, you've got those first ones on kind of generally in relation to conservatism, as well as comparing different strands, so the new right versus traditional, or one nation versus traditional conservatives, or one nation versus the new right. Then you've got four really key ones that can come up a lot. They're the extent to which they agree in relation to the state, the economy, society, and human nature. And then finally, you can definitely get questions on the extent to which they agree on key principles of conservatism, such as paternalism and hierarchy, tradition, and pragmatism. These aren't the only questions that can get asked, but if you know all of these really well and you have detailed essay plans for them and you're really well prepared for them, you should easily be able to adapt to any question that comes up on the exam. So yeah, let's start by looking at the emergence of conservatism. And what I thought we'd have a look at before looking at traditional conservatism is Hobbes, because Hobbes in a lot of textbooks is described as a traditional conservative. In reality, he came way before conservatism was even an ideology. The reason he's in the spec is because a couple of his key ideas are very consistent with the key ideas of conservatism that come about later, especially with Burke. So he's definitely worth looking at. And I think if you have to describe him as one strand in your essays, you can describe him as a traditional conservative. So, as I said, he preceded the development of conservatism as an ideology, but his most important work, Leviathan, which if any of you go to university and study politics, you'll definitely be reading, sets out some of the key ideas that will be consistent with conservatism, in particular in relation to human nature and the role of the state. So in relation to human nature and the state, he argued that in the absence of a state, in the state of nature, human life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish and short. And that was him supporting a view of human nature as inherently self-interested and prone to conflict, as he believed that effectively if humans were just left to be on their own, they'd all pursue their own goals and that would inevitably lead to conflict. And as kind of we'll look at later, that's very much agreed upon among conservatives and becomes one of their key principles. And this led to him supporting a very strong state which could provide order and security. He believed that this state was necessary to curb these kind of natural tendencies of human nature, this natural human imperfection, and he believed that the state should have the power to enforce laws, maintain peace, and therefore prevent this chaos of the state of nature. And again, this very much influences later conservative thought in relation to the kind of importance of a strong, stable state in providing order and security in society. So therefore, kind of as I kind of mentioned at the start, he's not necessarily a conservative because he preceded conservatism, but his ideas are very consistent with conservatism. And if you have to describe him as one of the strands, your best bet is probably traditional conservatism. Now we'll look at the real emergence of conservatism, and this was especially with Edmund Burke in relation to the French Revolution. So what you see is in 1789, the French Revolution upends French society, including its kind of traditional aristocratic, religious order, And it does so in kind of the name of the Enlightenment and the name of these liberal values of liberty, equality, and fraternity. And that saw a dramatic restructuring of society and of government, including the overthrow of monarchy, the violent reign of terror, and this alarmed many, mainly, or kind of chief of those who were alarmed was Edmund Burke, who at the time was an English MP, a Whig MP, and he became known as the father of conservatism for articulating a new political stance, effectively in response and in opposition to the French Revolution. His key text, which kind of shows this, is Reflections on the Revolution in France, and he argued for the real importance of maintaining established institutions, social hierarchy, and the gradual evolution of institutions. So he saw social hierarchy and established traditions and institutions being really threatened by the French Revolution, and he was really scared, effectively, that that would happen in England, and he kind of effectively advocated the importance of maintaining the structure of society as it was, with these traditions, these institutions, and social hierarchy. And he crucially didn't just think that traditions were useful for tradition's sake. He saw tradition as reflecting kind of the accumulated wisdom of the past. So there's a reason that things are still there, and there's a reason that traditions maintain. And that's because they reflect kind of an internal knowledge of what works well in society. Therefore, you shouldn't kind of simply go and upend them in the name of these kind of abstract principles, often Enlightenment, liberal principles. Some of them also, fraternity comes to be very key in socialism of the French Revolution. So conservatism therefore arose not just as a counter to liberalism's emphasis on individual rights and reason, but also as a practical response to the kind of perceived excesses and unpredictability and challenges of revolutionary change, which is where Burke really, and traditional conservatism, really advocates more gradual change as a key principle. And Burke's articulation of these ideas laid the groundwork for what will become conservatism. So he's very much the father of conservatism, in the same way that Locke is could maybe be considered the kind of key father of liberalism, especially classical liberalism. So this is the first strand we're going to look at. That very much leads us on to traditional conservatism. And it's grounded in several key principles that emerge as a reaction to the French Revolution. First one of those is pragmatism, which really emphasizes the importance of practical experience over abstract theorizing. So he saw the French Revolution as being driven by these abstract principles, the abstract political principles, the idealistic principles of equality, of fraternity. And he believed that decisions shouldn't be based on these kind of abstract principles and kind of utopian ideas. Instead, they should be based on the accumulated wisdom of history and tradition. And you should be pragmatic and focus on what works. You shouldn't try and kind of sail off, and this brings into Oakeshott, we'll look at in a minute, but you shouldn't kind of sail off in an uncertain direction to try and pursue something perfect. You should try and keep the ship afloat in uncertain waters. And he also set out the importance of changing to conserve in this regard. So this is crucial to understand. Conservatives aren't reactionaries. They don't think you shouldn't change at all. They believe in tradition, but they also recognise that you need in society careful and gradual reform to preserve the essence of traditions and institutions. Because if you simply don't change at all, then there's going to be a revolution, similar to the French Revolution. So this kind of change into conserve recognises that in order to conserve tradition within society, which is a key belief in within conservatism, a key principle of conservatism, you sometimes need to change a bit in order to conserve that, and that reflects their real pragmatism. It's linked on to the next principle, which is very much tradition, as I've talked about just then, kind of the accumulated wisdom of the past. And effectively, tradition shouldn't be gotten rid of in revolutions in favour of new ideas. It should be listened to because it reflects the teachings of the past and fundamentally what works in society. Linked in a little bit into property as well, which is really key for conservatives, also key for conservatives' idea of stability in society. So they see property ownership as really important, as owning property encourages responsibility, discourages support for radical ideologies that threaten to upturn the social order, such as revolutions, such as the French Revolution. Finally, or a couple more key principles that Burke really articulated, and you'll see in the rest of this video, come to be really key principles of conservatism, are hierarchy and authority. So he saw hierarchy in society as natural and necessary for a stable society, and he thought it should be protected rather than upended. And crucially, this also linked into the idea of an organic society, that society can't be planned. Society develops organically, it's more like a plant than a machine, and therefore change needs to be gradual. You need to be understanding and respectful of these traditions, and understand that you can't just plan a society. You need to kind of nurture it and allow it to continue to evolve in the correct way. And then finally, Burke's conservatism really acknowledged human imperfection, which is another key principle of conservatism. He argued that humans are fallible and limited in their capacity to understand and engineer complex systems, another key principle of conservatism, and therefore humility and restraint should guide political actions, advocating for incremental change rather than radical overhaul. So these kind of key principles, pragmatism, tradition, hierarchy and authority, organic society, human imperfection, form the real bedrock of Burke's conservative thought, form the bedrock of conservatism, but in particular traditional conservatism, with a kind of real focus on cautious, evolutionary approach to society and political life and change, rather than kind of radical idealistic approach. So, and I thought it'd be useful to quickly have a look at, okay, how are these ideas implemented in practice when interpreting the 19th century and interpreting Britain? And I think this is something that you can use kind of this to expand in your essays on kind of what traditional conservatism meant. So it led them to strongly supporting the monarchy and the Church of England. So these were key traditions, key institutions of British society, and they saw them as key kind of pillars of this tradition and also pillars of order within society. That led to them to support the monarchy irrespective of who the monarch was. An initial opposition to the Catholic Emancipation Act of 1929, which allowed Catholics to hold public office, which shows that real support for the Church of England. Conservatives in this period also strongly supported maintaining a hierarchical societal structure and recognised that a key role of the state was to provide order and security in society. This can crucially be seen under Prime Minister Robert Peel. He established the Metropolitan Police Service in 1829. This kind of moved towards this professional, organised police force, emphasised the traditional conservative belief in law and order in society and preventing disorder effectively. But its belief in a kind of cohesive society, an organic society, which we'll look at in a little bit more detail much later in the video when we look at the core principles, can be seen as kind of support for neighbourhood policing, which argued that policing shouldn't just be done by force, but through a shared understanding with the public, and police being closely connected with the communities they serve. So kind of community was relatively important, and this kind of links into tradition as well in society, and kind of learning from tradition and learning from hierarchy as well. And then conservative support for hierarchy can be seen in the fact that many of them initially opposed the 1832 Reform Act, so they eventually kind of have to accept it, and actually later, One Nation conservatism, Disraeli implemented the Second Reform Act as kind of an articulation, and it can be seen as a really good example of changing to conserve. But initially, the traditional conservatives in the kind of early 19th century were really opposed to it because they thought it was really threatening and changing society and altering it, which could potentially disrupt the social order, undermine the influence of the aristocracy, and therefore undermine hierarchy in society. Final thing we're going to have a quick look at for traditional conservatism is Michael Oakeshott. He's one of your key thinkers, and it's his restatement of traditional conservatism in the mid-20th century. So obviously, conservatism emerges in the very late 18th century under Burke, and his kind of traditional conservatism is really supported, continued support in the 19th century. We'll look at in a minute. After that, you see One Nation conservatism emerging. But it's kind of a return and a restatement of key conservative principles by Oakeshott in the mid-20th century. I know that some teachers teach Oakeshott as a One Nation conservative, and I know, to be honest, I think there's worse things you can do. You can use him as an example of a One Nation conservative, but in reality, he very much described himself as a traditional conservative and set out key kind of traditional conservative views. I mean, I think this potentially shows there's not a major difference between the two of them, which we'll kind of address kind of later in the video as well. So, but as I was talking about, in the mid-20th century, Oakeshott was really important in restating the importance of traditional conservatism, especially in his essay on being conservative. And his conservatism, again, restating the key principle, was anchored in pragmatism. He argued that political action should be guided by practical knowledge and experience rather than ideological dogmatism or theoretical abstractions. That's quite a lot of big words, but kind of we should decide political decisions based on what works, based on what's worked in the past, based on tradition, not based on these idealistic ideas of designing an ideal society. And this was in particular, in his context, a counter to kind of utopian visions of perfect societies promoted by both communism and fascism in the 20th century. They were very much driven by these kind of abstract ideals, abstract kind of concepts, rather than by practicalities and by pragmatism. And he saw that as not only kind of impractical, but deeply dangerous due to their tendency to justify radical and disruptive changes, therefore linking back to the kind of traditional conservative view that actually these radical disruptive changes aren't good. It should be gradual reform within society. There's a quote there you can have a quick read of where he kind of explained this view. Importantly, he kind of also re-emphasized the importance of learning from tradition, viewing it kind of not as a static entity, but as a dynamic, evolving process. Kind of within it has this accumulated wisdom and experience of the past and should really be listened to. And this was also coupled with an acknowledgement of human imperfection, another key traditional conservative principle, and a key conservative principle as a whole. So he recognised that human beings are inherently limited in their knowledge and their capacity to design perfect systems. He supported the view that human imperfection was a constant and that politicians therefore needed to accommodate it rather than try and alter it. And he ultimately wrote in On Being Conservative, the office of government is not to impose other beliefs and activities upon its subjects, but to secure them in the enjoyment of what they have chosen. So you shouldn't try and change people. We shouldn't try and kind of design something perfect. Ultimately, it's also about kind of accommodating human nature as it is. And we'll look a little bit later in the video about his further views on human nature. He also moved a little bit away from Hobbes, still emphasizing human imperfection, but a little bit less negative view. He kind of thought humans were more fallible and make mistakes rather than being kind of inherently self-interested and therefore leading to a really destructive society. Though very much shared the idea that there was human imperfection and that needs to be managed rather than seeking to be changed. What we're going to have a quick look at now is the next strand of conservatism. That's one nation conservatism. And this crucially developed in the mid to late 19th century in response to societal change. And these key societal changes were brought about by industrialization, as well as the growing influence and appeal of socialism among the working classes. And Disraeli was key in the development of one nation conservatism. They represented, or one nation conservatism as a whole, represented a strategic and philosophical adaptation of traditional conservative values to the realities of a changing society. And this is what I want you to consider. It's both of those. So on the one hand, it's this philosophical idea, this idea of noblesse oblige, this idea of paternalism, the idea that the upper classes should look after society a little bit more, and they had the moral responsibility to look after them, or look after the well-being of the less fortunate. And this resulted in certain policies we'll look at in a minute that looked after or kind of aimed to improve the living and working conditions for the lower classes. So that's this philosophical idea that sometimes you can explain it with, that they really justified this move towards a little bit more state intervention and helping those lower down in society a little bit more. But crucially, it's also strategic. What you have in this time is a growing working class within the context of industrialization. You have growing support for socialism. And as a result, one nation conservatives recognise that they need to change something in order to stay in power. And this is the idea of changing to conserve, going back to kind of this key conservative principle of changing to conserve. If you simply change nothing, you risk society being completely upended. You risk this societal upheaval. However, if you're willing to change some things, it allows you to conserve tradition and the key kind of hierarchy, key tradition and key principles of society. And that's what they did. They understood that in this changing society, in industrial capitalism, it's necessary to address the grievances of the working and lower classes. Otherwise, socialism would grow, support for socialism would grow, which would threaten revolution and the complete removal of these key traditions, these key kind of hierarchy and key institutions that they sought to preserve. So that kind of explanation, that it can be seen as both strategic and philosophical, I think is a really good way to explain the shift to one nation conservatism. Crucially, a final key part of it, and why it's kind of called one nation conservatism, is that they really emphasise patriotism and the idea of a cohesive society. And this was through the idea of promoting the idea that everyone was together in one nation, and patriotism was key to that. And he believed, like Disraeli in particular, believed that emphasising national unity and shared values was essential to countering the class divisions and the language of social class that socialists were using. So by promoting this national identity, they aim to kind of bridge the divide between the classes, uniting society around common goals and values, and crucially, maintaining hierarchy and preventing the threat to hierarchy and to tradition in society. So let's have a look at this in practice in the 19th century. So in practice in the 19th century, Disraeli's government enacted a number of social reforms, which improved living conditions for the working classes in the context of social and economic disparities that industrialisation created. Public Health Act of 1875 and the Artisans and Labourers Dwellings Improvement Act of 1875 improved public health and sanitary conditions in towns and cities, whilst the Factory Act reduced the working day for women and children and sought to kind of improve safety practices within factories. Disraeli also introduced income tax as a permanent tax for the first time in order to give the government a steady source of revenue. This taxation wasn't progressive though, and it's important not to over-exaggerate the extent of One Nation's conservative support for government intervention in this period. They certainly believed in greater state intervention than traditional conservatives, and most definitely more than neoliberals. However, they weren't modern liberals. They're far from modern liberals. They're far from, let alone, they're way far away from socialists. So I think that shouldn't be exaggerated as well. We're going to look at that in a lot more detail later in the video when we look at kind of the differences in their views over capitalism. Disraeli's government, as I kind of mentioned earlier, also introduced the Second Reform Act, and that can be seen as this kind of recognition of the importance of changing to conserve as a kind of strategic. Disraeli believed that by extending the franchise, it would kind of reduce the likelihood of social unrest and kind of increase support for the Conservative Party, and therefore prevent make less important support for socialism and the likelihood of kind of revolution, this big change. Therefore, seeking to, the kind of key point of seeking to maintain tradition and hierarchy within society. Importantly, and I think this is worth considering, is One Nation conservatism in practice in the 20th century. So what you might look at is be very, very confused, because in the 19th century you see these relatively very modest reforms being described as One Nation conservatism. They very much are One Nation conservatism. Then you might look at the 20th century, especially in the post-World War II period, and see other people being described as One Nation conservatives in this period, in particular Prime Ministers like Harold Macmillan, etc. That was a vastly different type of policy, right? By the kind of mid to late 20th century, these One Nation conservatives were kind of justifying not reversing nationalisation of key industries, far, far away from the extent of state intervention earlier on. But it's important to recognise that this is still One Nation conservatism, and important to recognise why. That's because the One Nation conservatism isn't the particular policies they're supporting, it's the approach. It's the pragmatic approach to the changing political and economic context, and ultimately the recognition that you need to change to conserve sometimes. So in the 19th century, there hadn't been much that they needed to adapt to, right? They recognised that in the context of industrialisation, they needed to, and the context of the growing support for socialism, they needed to adapt a little bit, provide some kind of help to those who are lower down in society, create a new kind of vision of national unity, and that's kind of the idea of a one nation and cohesive society in order to tackle this. But it's not a kind of major state intervention or anything like that. In the 20th century, what you see is them accepting this much greater state intervention, and that's because of the social and political context. After 1945, after the Second World War, you see Labour governments, in particular the Labour government of Clement Attlee, introducing massive reforms, which massively increased the size of the state, in particular nationalisation and a growing welfare state. One Nation conservatives came in this period in conservative governments, and they were also kind of those who weren't in government kind of analysing it as well. They accepted these changes. They certainly didn't kind of massively support them or seek to introduce them themselves. But they recognised that once they'd been introduced, it was very, very difficult to remove them. without the threatening hierarchy and threatening greater support for socialism and therefore greater reforms. And then therefore they kind of accepted some of these reforms, so the mixed economy, comprehensive welfare state, nationalisation of key industries, because it was ultimately the pragmatic thing to do, focusing on what works and focusing on what was going to kind of keep them in power, the Conservative Party in power, and what was going to and by being in power, they're able to protect tradition, right? They're able to protect these key principles, and if they kind of took a lot more radical approach, One Nation Conservative thought that would provide more of a threat, because ultimately you wouldn't then be changing to conserve. So yeah, as I've written at the bottom here, it's important to recognise that these didn't mean that One Nation Conservatives wholeheartedly supported all of these measures. In fact, many were originally opposed to them. Neither Churchill nor Macmillan extended kind of nationalisation when they were prime minister. They certainly didn't extend it. But the fact they didn't reverse them reflects not only a changing societal context, but their pragmatic approach and the importance of changing to conserve, as ultimately they didn't want to threaten hierarchy and tradition. What we're now going to have a look at, two key figures here, Reagan and Thatcher, is the emergence of a strand which had a very, very different approach to One Nation Conservatives. So, the new right emerged in the 1970s in reaction to what its proponents perceived as One Nation Conservatism's excessive concessions to socialist policies and ideas. So, this is kind of partly what it grew in relation to. It was also kind of a real growth in America, kind of neoliberal and neoconservatism, as ideas that kind of got imported into the UK as well. But this was important as well. They believed that kind of One Nation Conservatism had kind of moved away from conservative principles. And yeah, as I said, it was really associated with Thatcher in Britain and Ronald Reagan in the United States. And the new right positioned itself as the revival of true conservatism, arguing the One Nation had strayed far too far away from fundamental conservative principles. However, it's also important to recognise, and there's a real debate here to have about whether the new right should be considered conservatives at all, because they were also really influenced by the idea of classical liberalism, particularly in relation to their views on the economy and the state, and its emphasis on individual freedom and a free market economy. So it's important to keep that in mind as well. And we'll look at that in a lot more detail when we look at the kind of different principles and differences in the strands in relation to how they see the different principles. The new right is a combination of neoliberalism and neoconservatism. So neoliberalism is really rooted in classical liberal thought, advocates for minimal state intervention in the economy, emphasising free markets and individual enterprise. Neoconservatism, while sharing some principles with traditional conservatism, particularly in its focus on kind of traditional values, strong national defence and law and order, diverge in its approach to social policy and welfare. So that can be seen as neoconservatism more kind of from that conservative thought, but the new right is the combination of these two elements. So Thatcher was at once a neoliberal and a neoconservative. They weren't really in opposition to each other. So how did the new right reject many conservative principles? So this is kind of, on the one hand, they kind of maintain these traditional conservative principles, some of them, right, as I was talking about, in terms of traditional values within society, hierarchy, well, not so much hierarchy actually, kind of more the state providing order and defence. But they also kind of departed from a lot of key conservative traditions and conservative principles, which, as I kind of previously mentioned, begs the question of whether they should be considered conservatives at all. And a key kind of departure was in atomism, instead of support for an organic society. So rather than traditional conservatism, which viewed society as interconnected, evolving organism, and you see this in One Nation Conservatism, where they talk about the idea of a cohesive society, the new right effectively perceives society as a collection of individuals. Each one is pursuing their own interests, leading to the best outcome when allowed maximum freedom without excessive state intervention. So I'm not talking about this idea of a cohesive society, the idea of a unit in society. Each bit, we'll look at, again, much more detail when we look at organic society, but each bit has its particular role. It's more just a collection of individuals, and then Thatcher even spoke of the idea that there's no society at all. She kind of effectively said that. And that crucially rejects these kind of key notions of hierarchy and paternalism as well, which are key principles of conservative thought. The new right also supports the view that humans are rational beings in a meritocratic system where individuals succeed based on their own efforts and talents and shouldn't be interfered with. This again represents a key rejection of the conservative principle of human imperfection and support for hierarchy and paternalism, Again, key principles of conservative thought. And again, unlike traditional and one-nation conservatism, which value pragmatism and tradition, the new right is much more ideologically driven, focused on and driven by the principles of freedom and individualism. And that marks a significant transformation in the conservative landscape, away from the kind of cautious, gradual change, stability-focused approach of early conservatism to a more kind of dynamic, market-driven, individualistic ideology. So it's more ideological. Like conservatism, we're talking about as a political idea and as an ideology, but its emphasis on pragmatism seeks to kind of move away from ideology in driving its politics. But the new right kind of really shifts away from this, and in my opinion, they're quite ideologically driven. So therefore, as around the end, whilst the new right maintains some conservative elements, its core beliefs and priorities represent, or kind of a lot of its core beliefs and priorities represent a break from traditional conservative thought and conservative thought as a whole, with many questioning whether they should be considered conservatives at all. As I mentioned at the start, these are the kind of key questions you're answering in these essays, really thinking about to what extent is there agreement, to what extent is there disagreement. And this idea that actually one strand might not be considered conservatism at all can really be brought into your evaluations. You obviously don't have to agree with it, but or bring it in, but I think it can be a useful thing to do, even if it's a little bit of a high level kind of A-star level thing to do, and it needs to be done right. Just going to now have a quick look at the new right as a combination of neoliberalism and neoconservatism. So neoliberalism, an economic and political ideology that supports laissez-faire capitalism, free markets, low public spending, low taxation, and minimal government intervention in the economy. So Ayn Rand, for example, is strongly opposed to the welfare state, seeing it as curtailing individual freedom and a step towards authoritarianism. She said in The Virtue of Selflessness, one of her key texts, the difference between a welfare state and a totalitarian state is a matter of time. And you see that as a difference, a real key difference with one-nation conservatism. One-nation conservatism, of course, by no means are kind of ideologically supportive of a welfare state, but they do support kind of helping the lower classes a little bit more, and in the right context, where it's necessary to kind of change in order to conserve and to maintain tradition and hierarchy in the structure of society, they're willing to accept it in the 20th century. Rooted in classical liberal thought, they believe that private enterprise and open competition of the market are the most efficient way to produce economic growth, whilst also not infringing upon individual freedom. As I said, very driven by individual freedom as well as a key kind of classical liberal view. And they ultimately believe that laissez-faire capitalism is the most moral economic system because of this, because they believe that respecting individual freedom and kind of laissez-faire capitalism is kind of a moral pursuit, not just kind of economic or kind of pragmatic, because they think is the best system approach as well. So yeah, real emphasis on individual autonomy and freedom, and this was influenced by a kind of more positive view of human nature as rational beings, and that contributed to their support for atomism and opposition to hierarchy and paternalism. So Ayn Rand kind of has a real opposition to paternalism and a real opposition to personal altruism, so charity. She kind of said in The Virtue of Selflessness, the man who attempts to live for others is a dependent. He is a parasite in motive and makes parasites of those he serves. So therefore, kind of she argued against personal altruism, against charity, because she believes it creates an unhealthy dependence in those who are supported. And she ultimately believes that the real moral pursuit is individual freedom and self-interest, not self-sacrifice for others. Neoconservatism then emphasised the key role of the state in maintaining order and security. So this is a key kind of part of the new right, which is a bit more consistent with conservatism, with kind of earlier conservative ideas, which you see in kind of Hobbes and continued into traditional and one-nation conservatism, as kind of later in the video we'll expand upon a lot more. And this stance was particularly poignant during the Cold War, kind of when the new right was really emerging, kind of to tackle the threat of the Soviet Union. It's a real support for strong defence. So advocated for a strong military and active international role for the country, but also a strong state in domestic affairs to kind of provide law and order, which reflected a belief in the necessity of a powerful government to uphold societal stability. Neoconservatism was also characterised by a cultural and moral dimension, and this is kind of this idea of anti-permissiveness in the 60s and 70s, so a return to what they call kind of Judeo-Christian values, so they kind of saw that in the 60s and 70s, what they described as moral and social decay, so increasing liberalisation in social policies and attitudes, especially those related to personal and sexual freedoms, and they pushed back against this liberalisation, promoting kind of the traditional nuclear family structure and religious values, which they see as key to underpinning kind of hierarchy, stability in society, and the social fabric. Ultimately, a lot of these views were very homophobic, very racist as well, and that should be recognised. Final thing to quickly look at, and final couple of things are: should they be seen as compatible or incompatible, neoliberalism and neoconservatism? Right. So as I said, they're in the same people. So this is why we call it the New Right, because Thatcher was simultaneously a neoliberal and a neoconservative. And the New Right as a whole is kind of seen as a conservative ideology rather than just neoconservatism. And on the one hand, they could be argued that they're kind of incompatible, right? The neoliberalism kind of comes from a liberal tradition, whereas neoconservatism from more of a conservative tradition. Neoliberalism supports decreasing the size of the state and level of state intervention, whilst neoconservatism supports a different or kind of more significant state role in defence and law and order. On the other hand, it can be argued that they are compatible and they did work together. So one was focused on the economy and advocated for a decreased role in the economy, whereas the kind of increased state role was within other areas in law and order, in defence, and crucially, if you spend less money in the economic sphere on less money on the welfare state, which Thatcher ultimately did, you can spend more money on law and order and defence. And yeah, crucially, finally, we're going to have a look at Thatcher's government as a case study of the New Right. Firstly, the neoliberalism of Thatcher's economic policy, and crucially that was in privatisation, so a key kind of laissez-faire principle. She privatised state-owned industries that have been nationalised by the Labour government in the post-World War II period, including British Telecom, British Gas, British Airways. Also deregulation, reduced a lot of regulation in the economy, which kind of culminated in the Big Bang reforms in London's financial district in the 1980s. Also, massively reduced tax. So UK's top rate of income tax was 83% when she came into power. It was a kind of heyday of social democracy, and was reduced to 40% by the time she left power. And she also introduced the right to buy scheme. So this is it's a bit more actually a reflection of a consistency in terms of support for property ownership. However, it's you can see it's a little bit driven by different principles in the New Right. In the New Right, it's driven by freedom. They thought that kind of people owning property was key to individual responsibility, rather than it being driven by an emphasis on social stability. But again, we'll look at that in a lot more detail later in the video when we look at capitalism. And then again, we can kind of see neoconservatism in Thatcher's government. So she prioritised defence and law and order. So every department got cut back in terms of funding apart from these departments. Her support for anti-permissiveness can be seen in a kind of very homophobic policy of Section 28, which prohibited the promotion of homosexuality by local authorities and in schools, which is actually very similar language to what you see in Russia today. And she also took a very firm stance against the Soviet Union during the Cold War, with a very close political alignment with US President Ronald Reagan. Okay, so what we're going to really look at now is probably the most important part of the video, which is also going to be very much the longest part of the video. And what we're going to look at is the core kind of principles and ideas of conservatism, the core agreements, and then within that, we're going to go into the kind of key tensions and disagreements between the strands where there are them. So we're going to look at these kind of core principles and ideas that are mentioned in the specification. So pragmatism, tradition, human imperfection, organic society, so slate, paternalism, and libertarianism, which is more very much specific to the New Right. I've obviously mentioned a lot of them already earlier on in the video, but we're going to look at them in real depth in terms of agreement, which you can really bring into your agreement paragraphs. And then we're also going to look in a lot of depth into the kind of tensions within them and disagreements between the strands in relation to them, as well as bring in some kind of additional principles, which I think are really important to know for the essay. So kind of we'll look at capitalism and kind of the idea that the state should provide order and security. And I think there might be one or two more as well. But yeah, so starting off though, we're going to have a look at pragmatism. So how is pragmatism a key principle of conservatism, and what is it? So it's key to shaping conservative approaches to the state, society, economy, and human nature, and it's crucially the idea that decisions should be made in a flexible way on the basis of what works, rather than being driven by ideology or dogmatic thinking. These kind of abstract principles as well, which will be kind of looked at at the start. That's where conservatism emerged from. It emerged from this opposition to the French Revolution. So yeah, as I kind of talk about here, Burke saw the French Revolution as a kind of dangerous departure from focusing on the teachings of tradition, and as a kind of focus on ideology and utopian thinking rather than the real pragmatic approach. So conservatism advocates, instead of these kind of abstract principles, it advocates for viewing society and state action in a cautious manner that listens to evidence. This strongly links to their belief in tradition, which they see as the accumulated wisdom of the past. They see it as the evidence. You should listen to this tradition. This is what kind of pragmatism advocates, and that it shouldn't be discarded in favour of idealistic visions of societal change. This leads to conservatives to be very wary of major reforms and leads them to advocate for gradual change. So in On Being Conservative, Michael Oakeshott, for example, set out the conservative case for pragmatism. He said, to be conservative, then, is to prefer the familiar to the unknown, to prefer the tried to the untried, fact to mystery, the actual to the possible, the limited to the unbounded, the near to the distant, the sufficient to the superabundant, the convenient to the perfect, present laughter to utopian bliss. And this is a key idea, that you shouldn't kind of have these idealistic visions. You shouldn't kind of really pursue utopianism. You should actually focus on what works, on being a bit more cautious, because that utopianism has real risks for society, has real risks for hierarchy, upending tradition hierarchy in society, which kind of demonstrated in kind of Burke's view in the French Revolution. He crucially also set out the idea that the state shouldn't try to change the lives or wants of its citizens through utopian ideology, crucially, kind of the opposition to radical idealistic changes was also linked to their belief in human imperfection. They believe that humans are fallible and limited. They therefore can't kind of pursue and design these ideal systems. They should listen to what's worked in the past in tradition rather than trying to do so. Importantly, though, and I touched on this earlier in the video, when looking at traditional conservatism and one nation conservatism, they don't believe in not changing at all, and this is part of their pragmatic approach. They're not reactionaries who just don't want to change at all. They believe in the principle of changing to conserve, which recognizes that while tradition should be listened to, some adaptation is necessary at times to maintain stability and prevent upheaval in the context of changing circumstances. So if you don't change at all, there's likely to be upheaval and a revolution, and therefore that's going to completely remove hierarchy and completely remove the kind of key traditions and principles of conservatism. Therefore, sometimes you need to adapt and accommodate parts of society and change to different contexts. Otherwise, you're not going to conserve at all. And as the below notes further detail, pragmatism is not only central to conservative views on the state and society, but also their support for a capitalist economy and their belief in the unchangeable nature of human nature, as we'll look at later in the video. So now we're going to have a quick look at is pragmatism in the strands of conservatism. And the key point is that it can be seen as important to the thought of traditional one-nation conservatives, but the new right in many ways can be seen as a rejection of a pragmatic approach. So, in traditional conservatism, pragmatism can be seen in their deep-rooted preference for existing institutions, proven practices, and theory over theory and ideology, and they're guided by this belief in tradition and the accumulated wisdom of the past. They see society as a complex and organic entity, where each part has evolved to play a specific role over time, and it's linked to that idea of organic society. And their approach to change is therefore one of careful adjustment rather than radical overhaul. And they consider the disruption of long-standing systems and traditions as potentially harmful and destabilizing, and think you should be much more pragmatic and listen to kind of tradition as the accumulated wisdom of the past. So therefore, pragmatism is linked to maintaining social order and stability, with changes only made when necessary to preserve the fundamental structure of society. One nation conservatism is where you can really see pragmatism in practice within conservative thought. So pragmatism and the centrality are kind of central to one nation conservatism and its emergence at all. They recognise one nation conservatism, especially Disraeli, who was quite important to the founding of one nation conservatism, recognise that in the face of societal changes brought about by industrialisation and capitalism, some degree of state intervention and reform was necessary to prevent social unrest and maintain national cohesion. And as a result, they advocated for pragmatic solutions that struck a balance between maintaining traditional values and bring in reforms that improve the welfare of the less privileged. You saw that in kind of some of these reforms that were introduced, the Public Health Act 1975, Artisans and Labourers Dwelling Act, and also kind of the Factory Act, which address the needs of the less privileged whilst maintaining kind of social hierarchy integral to conservative values. So it was seen as necessary, with growing support for socialism in society and growing industrialisation, they needed to adapt, they needed to change to conserve. Because with growing industrialisation, you had a growing working class, and you had also growing inequality. And therefore, with this changing context, you needed to help the lower classes a little bit more to kind of maintain cohesion in society. And this was crucially with the growth of socialism as well. With this growth of a working class, you needed to kind of have a vision and have a way to kind of gain support and kind of from the lower classes, and make sure that they didn't kind of completely revolt against the aristocracy and revolt against hierarchy, because otherwise that would completely upend society. So therefore, it's kind of simultaneously they're changing to conserve, or they're changing to conserve, I suppose. It has a philosophical approach, which we'll look at when we look at paternalism, but it also has a very kind of strategic, pragmatic approach. And this is also key to their kind of emphasis on nationalism and nationhood, which is kind of where one nation conservatism comes from, because they really emphasise the idea that everyone was together in one nation, one piece of society, and that was kind of them kind of trying to articulate a vision that would combat socialism and socialism's idea of class division and the idea of revolution and promotion of revolution within society. Crucially, the new right can be seen as rejecting pragmatism. So their emergence marked a significant departure from pragmatism, and they instead favoured a more ideological stance driven by a strong belief in negative freedom, which you'll look at when you look at liberalism. And this is really key. So pragmatism, as a central kind of tenet of conservatism, emphasises that you shouldn't be driven by ideology. The new right are driven by ideology. They're driven crucially by the promotion of freedom as an ideology. And that's particularly evident in their critique of one nation conservative thinkers in the 20th century, or I suppose Oakeshott takes a bit more of a traditional conservatism. So it's kind of critique of one nation conservatism and thinkers like Oakeshott in the 20th century, and they viewed their approaches, which embrace some state intervention and social welfare, as a capitulation. So that was looked at in more detail. Earlier in the video, we looked at one nation conservatism. They see this as a kind of capitulation to socialist ideals and a dilution of conservative principles. And Thatcher was really, as a member of the New Right, was really openly critical of this one nation conservative emphasis, which the one nation kind of conservatives in this period accepted it as part of kind of changing to conserve, as I kind of explained much earlier in the video. And neoliberalism, driven by freedom, driven by a key belief in promoting freedom, this underlined all of their views. So it's why they supported laissez-faire capitalism, because they believe it as the best way to promote individual freedom. And they kind of really promoted a kind of individual autonomy over government regulation and social welfare programs, which they saw as infringing upon this individual freedom. In social policy, the new rights returned to traditional values, crucially kind of in neoconservatism, and this idea of anti-permissiveness could be seen as pragmatic and could be seen as consistent with conservatism, but in some ways it can be seen as inconsistent with traditional and one nation conservatism, and can be seen as moving away from these conservative values, because it was a move away. It wasn't kind of rooted in pragmatism, it was rooted more in ideology, because they saw traditional values as kind of correct and desirable rather than as kind of a pragmatic response to societal issues. Obviously, in other ways, you can describe that as more of an agreement, as we'll kind of look at later in the video as well. So therefore, kind of it can be argued that in both economics and social policy, particularly in economics, the new right's position weren't driven by pragmatism; they were driven by ideology, which in a way is what pragmatism directly rejects. Therefore, overall, pragmatism a key principle within conservatism, and one that you can really see in traditional conservatives and one nation conservatives. There's a lot of agreement there, but ultimately is crucially rejected by the new right. Okay, next principle we're going to have a look at is tradition. I've talked about this a lot kind of earlier in the video. It's kind of a real central, if not the most central, principle of conservatism. And crucially, tradition is not just merely a set of customs. It's a reflection of collective experiences and lessons learned over time. So they see tradition as experience. It's the accumulated wisdom of the past, and it guides in how you should act in the present. So there's a reason that certain institutions have maintained. There's a reason that the monarchy, the Church of England, within the certain key institutions have maintained, and even if you might not completely understand them, you have to respect them and recognize that they kind of reflect what works in this kind of accumulated wisdom of the past, as they refer to it. So yeah, as I said, this can be seen in their support for monarchy in the Church of England, and crucially why they supported these key institutions of society. And they also see respecting tradition as crucial for maintaining stability and security within society. It's through the lens of tradition that they understand and approach change. So they favour cautious, gradual, organic change instead of abrupt, radical shifts, because it's about maintaining tradition and maintaining the fundamental structure of society. And they believe you shouldn't kind of completely upend societal norms. You should kind of slowly evolve them if you need to change at all. Burke, in particular, is key, as he was key to a lot of kind of the articulation of a lot of conservative principles, but key to the kind of articulation of tradition and why it was fundamental conservatism. And he crucially saw it as a critical thread linking past, present, and future generations, which created a sense of belonging and continuity. And his opposition to the French Revolution, which was kind of really key in the emergence of conservatism, was in large part due to its disregard for these teachings of tradition. So tradition isn't just for Burke about preserving old ways for their own sake. It's not for conservatives just about kind of maintaining tradition for tradition's sake. It's about recognizing and upholding what's tried and what's tested. So this links into that idea of empiricism as well. That tradition is ultimately what works in society. So traditional conservatives kind of effectively kind of support, kind of I've brought in Burke already, kind of support all of the above. They see it as kind of fundamental principle of traditional conservatism and influences all of their beliefs on society, the state, human nature, and the economy. It's also really important the ideas of one nation conservatives who kind of effectively completely agree with the view that tradition should be listened to in the accumulated wisdom of the past. They're very consistent with traditional conservatives in this view. In the face of societal change under industrialization, they recognise the need to change in order to conserve these traditions and this traditional structure of society and its key institutions. So their greater use of state power and state intervention, even though it was massive in the 19th century especially, to address social inequalities, was therefore consistent with tradition, and in order to protect it, it was kind of changing to conserve, as we discussed within Pragmatism. In the new right, I think it can be seen in two ways. On the one hand, the fact that they're driven by ideological beliefs, by the kind of promotion of freedom, can be seen as opposed to tradition. So they're not the kind of views on society and the state aren't driven by seeking to learn from the traditional, the accumulated wisdom of the past. Instead, they're kind of, in a way, ideologically driven by this promotion of freedom. That's why they support it. That's why they support capitalism. It's not because it's what's traditionally tried and tested. But on the other hand, we can see their support for tradition in neoconservative support for anti-permissiveness, which advocated for a return to traditional values within society. So they saw the kind of increasing liberalisation of social attitudes in the 1970s and advocated kind of for a return to kind of traditional, what they call Judeo-Christian values of the kind of nuclear family. Often a lot of these kind of views were quite homophobic. As well. So they kind of really emphasise this kind of preservation of the traditional family unit as they saw it, which they saw as the bedrock of kind of societal stability. So in this regard, we can see them as supporting tradition within society, and you see that in the kind of some examples here in the policies of Reagan and Thatcher. Cool. So that's tradition. Next kind of key principle we're going to have a look at is paternalism and hierarchy, which I've put a little bit together. So paternalism is a key principle shaping conservative thought on the state and society. It's the belief that the state should exert a benign influence from the above, so kind of helping society, governing in the interests of the people. So this reflects the conservative view that authority, when exercised responsibly by the upper classes normally, those who are in power, can be a force for good, which can guide society towards stability and welfare. So they see paternalism not as just a kind of about authority and authoritarianism, but about responsible governance that considers the welfare of all citizens. It's not kind of power for power's sake. And they believe that this enhances the social fabric and maintains stability in society by ensuring that those in positions of power use their authority for the greater good. The principle of paternalism is also rooted in their belief in human imperfection. Unlike liberals, they believe that not all individuals are equally capable of self-governance, and therefore they see them as benefiting from the guidance and support of those in power. And this is closely linked to their support for hierarchy. So they regard hierarchical structures as natural in society and necessary for maintaining order and stability. So they view it as kind of a natural, inevitable aspect of any well-ordered society, and argue that people are inherently different in terms of their abilities, talents, capabilities, and this leads to different roles, statuses, and this kind of hierarchy within society. And this kind of hierarchical structure holds that kind of this hierarchical structure doesn't only reflect these natural differences, but also ensures that those best suited to leadership and decision-making roles are in positions where they can be most effective. But as we'll look at this, I think there's a significant amount of disagreement in relation to paternalism and hierarchy within the strands of conservatism. So traditional conservatives can be seen as having an authoritarian approach, actually, which is quite different to this kind of idea, or a bit different to this idea of paternalism. So they argue that the state, embodying tradition and pragmatism, knows what is best for the people, and the kind of ruling class knows what is best for the people, and that all citizens should follow what they say because they have this knowledge. They respect tradition, they respect pragmatism, they are the aristocracy and the ruling class. And this can be seen as kind of somewhat authoritarian in nature. It's kind of top-down method decision making and governance by the ruling elite who are in power with no input from the general populace. They believe that this is necessary to ensure stability and order and the overall well-being of society. And in their view, the state's responsibility is to protect and provide for its citizens, kind of akin to a parent's duty to care for their children. So that's where you see that kind of paternalism coming in. So it's kind of an authoritarian version of paternalism. And linked to this was their real strong support for hierarchy. So they viewed it as an essential component of a well-ordered, functioning society. So Burke, for example, demonstrated his belief that hierarchy was natural by stating, "We fear God. We look up with awe to kings, with affection to parliaments, with duty to magistrates, with reverence to priests, and with respect to nobility." So there's kind of real articulation that the kind of hierarchy is natural, and we should look to those who are in power and kind of respect their decisions as kind of almost kind of they have the right to rule effectively. And this kind of support for hierarchy can be seen kind of from traditional conservatives in the early 19th century in their original opposition by people like Robert Peel, can be seen as considered a traditional conservative, to the 1832 Reform Act, which sought to restructure the British electoral system. So they saw kind of argue this potential reform that would disrupt the social order and undermine the influence of the aristocracy, which kind of shows their support for hierarchy. One Nation conservatives, kind of paternalism is central to One Nation conservatism. So they aren't supporters of paternalism. They believe it's the responsibility of the state and upper classes to safeguard and look after the welfare of the less privileged in society who are unable to look after themselves. So it's kind of a bit of a departure from this traditional conservative kind of authoritarian vision that the state knows what's best and should be listened to a more kind of philosophically driven idea of paternalism that the state should really look after its citizens as they're unable to look after themselves. And that was kind of framed in their broader kind of vision for kind of where One Nation comes from, that society's one cohesive unit that was united by patriotism in particular. So this paternalistic approach is rooted in a sense of moral duty with the concept, so this is kind of philosophical aspect of it, the concept of noblesse oblige, which means literally nobility obliges, so that those in privileged power are obligated, they have a duty to act with generosity and responsibility to those who are less fortunate. And it's kind of sees them as kind of a benevolent guardian to kind of help the welfare of those who are less privileged. And kind of I've talked about these examples a number of times earlier in the video, but you see this in kind of the Public Health Act and a couple of other acts, including the Factory Act and Artisan and Labourers Dwellings Improvement Act under Disraeli's government. Importantly, though, this kind of support for paternalism and shift within One Nation conservatism to helping the lower classes a little bit more shouldn't simply be seen in a kind of philosophical way of this kind of belief in noblesse oblige. It should also be seen in terms of a strategic move in terms of pragmatism. They recognise that support for socialism would grow, whereas inequality was growing and kind of class consciousness was growing in society, kind of a growing working class. And they therefore recognised that they needed to help the lower classes a bit more in order to prevent revolution, because otherwise there would be unrest, and that would threaten tradition and the key kind of structure and stability and hierarchy within society. And that's crucially seen in kind of Disraeli, a key One Nation conservative, in his quote that the palace is not safe when the cottage is not happy. So you need to keep the cottage, you need to keep the people lower down in society happy in order to protect hierarchy in society as well. So this paternalism isn't just about kind of this ideal like shift to kind of really helping out the lower classes. It's also a kind of pragmatic element to maintain hierarchy in society. The New Right, by contrast, you can see kind of Ayn Rand here, can be seen as fundamentally rejecting the principles of paternalism and hierarchy. So they rejected the notion of the state as protector and provider, instead arguing that excessive state intervention not only curtailed individual freedom, but also stifled economic growth and innovation, kind of really opposed almost any state intervention at all. It's not like traditional One Nation conservatives supported loads of state intervention. So instead of emphasising hierarchy and social stability, they were driven by promoting the principles of individualism, autonomy, meritocracy in society and the economy. So there's kind of this, again, as we spoke about a little bit earlier when we looked at pragmatism and their rejection of pragmatism, it's kind of this ideological driven ideology, I suppose, driven by the ideology of freedom. So they championed minimising government intervention in both economic affairs and social welfare, and an economic system where the market, capitalism, so this laissez-faire capitalism, would dictate economic outcomes, and this would lead to greater economic efficiency and prosperity. And in this context, kind of this hierarchy and this paternalism were kind of relics of an outdated social order that kind of hindered free market capitalism and hindered this promotion of individual freedom. And you see this in their kind of support for atomism in society. They don't support kind of hierarchy anymore. It's really about kind of, Margaret Thatcher even said at one point, there is no society. It's this idea that just lots of individuals, they don't see kind of society as one, this cohesive unit, and they really don't support this kind of paternalism or hierarchy. And crucially, the New Right's opposition to paternalism can be seen in Ayn Rand's opposition to the concept of personal altruism, so this concept of helping others, which she viewed as the moral obligation to place the needs of others above one's own interests. And she believed that this created a dependency in those who were helped, and therefore undermined kind of individual freedom. Therefore, the kind of moral pursuit wasn't kind of helping the ruling class, helping those who are lower down in society in a paternalistic way. It's rational self-interest, and it's individualism, and it's leaving people alone, which kind of shows the kind of key classical liberal influence in their ideology as well. On the other hand, kind of a slight maybe agreement or acceptance of hierarchy is that in their acceptance of laissez-faire capitalism and rejection of a welfare state and redistribution, it was kind of inevitable that this would lead to some level of inequality within society and the maintaining of some level of hierarchy. Because ultimately, if you introduce laissez-faire capitalism at a point where some are richer and have more privileges and some are poorer, it's not going to massively change that system. Obviously, potentially they advocated that it would do within a meritocracy, but ultimately in their promotion of laissez-faire capitalism, there was some acceptance of continued inequality. So that's kind of one limited area where you can potentially see that agreement in terms of hierarchy. Okay, moving on now to the next kind of key principle, and this isn't one that is named, but it's kind of really shared and important, really to bring in, especially in relation to the economy, and that's capitalism and property. So capitalism and property rights are strongly supported by conservatives, rooted in these kind of other key principles of pragmatism, respect for tradition, and the concept of an organic society. And this is really a really good thing to do when you're kind of looking at these agreement points and agreement paragraphs within your conservative essays. Link them back to these other kind of key principles of conservatism to explain them. So if you can explain capitalism through the other principles, which they really are central to, like tradition and pragmatism, that will really impress the examiner and allow you to kind of explain it in quite a detailed way. So they support capitalism primarily due to pragmatism. They see it as the system that works, the most practical and efficient economic system. It aligns with this pragmatic approach and is proven to generate wealth and improve living standards. So they're very wary of idealistic visions of changing the economy through state intervention, which they saw as really dangerous. And their support for hierarchy means that conservatives are very comfortable with the inequality that capitalism produces. Further, conservatives, like capitalism, is seen as kind of a part of tradition. It's the system that's kind of often been there in many societies. Therefore, it should be respected and listened to as this kind of accumulated wisdom of the past, rather than discarded. And they also see it as important to the organic society. Kind of this idea of the market and individuals naturally trading with each other is kind of a key part of this, like links into, we'll look at this in more detail in a bit, the idea of an organic society and of kind of just letting society evolve as it does rather than seeking to design it. Crucially, property is really important to conservatism as well. So it's seen as a cornerstone of a stable society. So kind of this stable, this order, stability in society is really important. And they argue that ownership encourages responsibility and discourages support for socialist ideology that upturns the social order. So the right to property is also intertwined with the conservative emphasis on an organic society, where individual ownership kind of forms part of the social fabric as well, contributing to the kind of overall health of society as a whole. As I look at now, though, there are kind of significant differences between the different strands of conservatism, especially in relation to the extent of state intervention in the economy they support. And you'll bring this in particular in your kind of essays on conservatism and the economy. Okay, so first, looking at traditional conservatism's view on capitalism. So they're strong supporters of capitalism and property, which they see as kind of due to pragmatism and tradition. So they're kind of both also seen as important to maintaining a hierarchy in society, which is kind of key principles for traditional conservatism. They didn't support paternalistic economic policies to the same extent as one nation conservatives did, but also weren't libertarians ideologically opposed to state intervention in the economy like the New Right, which we'll kind of look at both of those in a second. So Burke was kind of actually wary of the potential of completely unregulated economic liberalism and the unfettered pursuit of individual wealth, though he did kind of generally support kind of relatively free market capitalism. He also wasn't strongly really supportive of it in the same way that kind of classical liberals were, because they were kind of worried about these kind of free markets undermining order and stability within society, and this led to some early conservatives really supporting protectionism of national industries from foreign competition. But it's also important to recognise that traditional conservatism was articulated prior to the kind of full development of industrialisation and capitalism that later conservatives were writing in. And it seems reasonable to suggest, I think, that their beliefs in changing to conserve and pragmatism may have led them to supporting similar policies to one nation conservatives, given this change context. And you can debate this, you can argue that's not the case, but I think that could be a decent argument you can bring in. And I think this idea that one nation conservatives are development of traditional conservatism with the idea of changing to conserve is a kind of really good kind of point of evaluation you can bring in when kind of comparing the strands and thinking about agreement versus disagreement. So, one nation conservatism strongly supports capitalism due to the pragmatic approach and respect for tradition that it shares with traditional conservatism, but due to their greater emphasis on paternalism and the need to change to conserve and the changing context of industrialisation, they support a bit more state intervention to ensure the welfare of all members of society. So they recognise that in the face of societal changes and increasing inequality brought about by industrialisation, some degree of state intervention and reform was necessary to prevent social unrest and maintain national cohesion. So with support for socialism growing, this change was necessary to conserve the hierarchical, stable nature of society and prevent a socialist revolution if they kind of didn't help those lower down in society, which would threaten it. And they were also influenced by their paternalism, which led to the belief that the state should take proactive steps to improve the welfare of the less privileged members of society through policies designed to alleviate poverty and provide social welfare. And we looked at that a little bit earlier in the video, so I'm just going to kind of skip through this relatively quickly, have a read, but you see this in the 19th century with Disraeli's governments, kind of introducing key things to kind of improve kind of the conditions for those lower down in society, whilst also introducing income tax. So it's kind of not like they're introducing this massive progressive taxation, but did recognise you needed a bit of kind of income taxation to spend a little bit more in society and help those lower down in society with kind of growing demands on the state. And you also see it in the 20th century. So in the 20th century, you see kind of prime ministers like Macmillan, Churchill, taking a similarly pragmatic approach. They didn't introduce nationalisation. They didn't introduce this kind of mixed economy. They didn't introduce a big welfare state, but they recognised that actually removing it would really threaten society, would threaten the kind of structure, the stability, hierarchy, tradition within society, and they therefore supported maintaining it. And that can be really seen in their pragmatic approach, where they would accept some state intervention, Can also be seen in their real support for kind of property building in the period. So Macmillan built around 300,000 homes per year when he was Prime Minister. And yeah, as I kind of say in the end, is that this doesn't mean that One Nation Conservatives in this period supported nationalisation, supported this much greater state intervention, but it's a recognition of their support for capitalism and their understanding of economics and also their understanding of society and all of their views as a whole is based on this kind of pragmatic approach and the need to change in order to conserve. The New Right's view on capitalism is quite different. So they kind of partly came to prominence in response to this kind of, especially in the UK, in response to One Nation Conservatism, acceptance of post-war reforms, in particular this kind of acceptance of the extensive welfare state and nationalisation, and they saw themselves as the true conservatives through their return to a neoliberal economic approach, their return to free market capitalism, and advocated for rolling back the state in the economy and welfare. So they were driven by libertarianism, which is a key kind of principle mentioned in the specification, which is kind of very much specific to neoliberalism and the New Right. And this centred on the promotion of liberty, autonomy, and free choice, particularly in economic affairs, and resulted in them advocating for very minimal state intervention in the economy and for laissez-faire capitalism. So they believed in limited taxation, low public spending, little regulation, so that individuals and businesses were left free to act how they wish. So they can be seen where they're really driven by freedom again, by the ideology of freedom. So they believe that the state's role should be very much limited to the narrow function of protecting individuals from force, theft and fraud, and enforcing contracts, rather than redistributing wealth or managing the economy. Nozick, for example, kind of saw state intervention as a real threat, argued that the minimal state is the most extensive state that can be justified. Any state more extensive violates people's rights. So they didn't just see laissez-faire capitalism as the most kind of pragmatic, efficient system. They ultimately saw it as the most moral economics system because it didn't interfere with free choice and largely left people alone to a much greater extent than greater state intervention in the economy did. And Nozick's justification for libertarianism really built upon Immanuel Kant's principle that individuals should never be treated as means to an end, but always as an end in themselves. So he argued that respecting individual rights is the core obligation of the state and society, and that ultimately taxation and kind of this greater state intervention threatened those rights and then kind of went against those rights. And he argued that taxation on labour, on work, is on par with forced labour because you're kind of making people. Ultimately, taxation is implemented through the threat of force. New Right also strongly supported property rights, believing property ownership to be a kind of fundamental right and important, promoting self-reliance and economic initiative. And they argue that individuals, when they have property rights, they're more inclined to take care of their property and make productive use of it, leading to overall economic growth and stability. So that's kind of really consistent. So they do support capitalism, which can be seen as consistent as their type of capitalism, real free market capitalism, that can be seen as different. But they do kind of really support property, but again, it's kind of for different reasons. It's driven by individual freedom, in particular, rather than kind of by stability in society, which is kind of a bit more key for traditional and One Nation Conservative support for it. And you see, let's have a quick read here in some of the writing of Ayn Rand and Robert Nozick. In there, you can see kind of opposition to a welfare state and support for the idea that free market capitalism supports individual rights. And I've already gone through this much earlier in the video, but you can also see here how neoliberalism was really promoted and implemented under Thatcher with kind of privatisation of these nationalised industries, deregulation, lowering tax massively, and also the right to buy scheme in terms of implementing property. And you can bring these are never, these kind of practical examples should never be the centre of your essays, by no means, but I don't think there's any harm in kind of bringing them in here and there, maybe once a paragraph as an example, just to illustrate your point. Okay, so the next conservative principle we're going to have a look at, or kind of key agreement and principle, is the idea of an organic society or state. And this is key to conservative thought, and it emphasises that society and the state develop naturally and cannot be artificially designed or engineered. So they disagree with the liberal view that a state and society can be designed through rational thought and thinking, like a machine, Instead, they view it as more of a plant, as more of a living organism that needs to be kept alive, and that we don't necessarily completely understand. Every part of it is crucial to the whole, and changes occur gradually and naturally through an evolutionary process rather than through intentional planning, as kind of liberals or socialists kind of advocate. This intentional planning, they believe, kind of creates big risks. So it kind of inherently values stability and cohesion of the whole over the needs and desires of individual parts, which is also really important for this idea. And Oakeshott's idea of kind of boat analogy is really important to this, or key in illustrating this. So he argued that political activity is like navigating a boat in a sea, and that this boat, you shouldn't try and kind of go off in some uncertain utopian direction. Instead, you should seek to kind of make constant, careful adjustments and keep it afloat in uncertain waters. So they believe that society and the state have developed the way they have for a reason. And rather than seeking to change them suddenly, we should listen to tradition and seek to maintain the structure of society. And this reflects the conservative principle of empiricism and focusing on what the past and present can teach us rather than seeking to design a kind of hypothetical ideal future as socialists do. So authority and hierarchy, therefore seen as natural and necessary components of a cohesive society, which is key to why they support them. And this structure is not arbitrarily imposed, but has emerged naturally over time and should therefore be listened to, rather than trying to design something different. In the UK, this leads to conservatives opposing codification of the Constitution. So they view the British Constitution, unwritten and shaped by centuries of tradition and practice, as a prime example of an organic political system, which is flexible, adaptable, and deeply embedded in the kind of UK's history and culture. And for conservatives, the gradual development of this system is preferable to any kind of attempt to impose or design a kind of a rational design structure, as this kind of system, as it's developed, reflects tradition, reflects this accumulated wisdom of the past. So let's look at organic society in the strands of conservatism, and also kind of some more specific views on society as well, which we can bring in. So traditional conservatives really support an organic society and support localism, crucially in Burke's idea of little platoons. So they strongly endorse the concept of an organic society with a deep respect for tradition and established institutions. This leads them to support kind of key institutions like the Church of England and monarchy, seeing them as not kind of only relics of the past, but as key organs of society that provide continuity, stability, and a sense of identity to society. And they really don't agree with dismantling these institutions in the pursuit of ideological goals, which is kind of a key idea of the emergence of socialism, as in opposition to the French Revolution. And this kind of support for organic society can be seen in Burke's advocacy for localism and little platoons of society. So by little platoons, he meant smaller communities and associations, such as families, local communities, social groups, scout groups, for example. I think it was a key example he often used, that provide individuals with security, status, and a sense of belonging. So traditional conservatives saw society as this collection of localized communities, and have naturally developed with lots of these different parts, which are all important to the whole, but the whole of society is more important. And it's these kind of smaller localized communities, little platoons, where people learn their have their primary loyalties and learn values. They learn these kind of values and are guided by these values and ideas of tradition. And they're therefore essential to teaching tradition and nurturing a cohesive society and promoting the idea that society is more important than any individual part. One Nation conservatives crucially also support a kind of organic cohesive society. So they agree with traditional conservatism's view that society should develop organically, respecting all established traditions and institutions. And it can also be seen in their kind of in why they're called One Nation conservatism, their real promotion of a cohesive, patriotic national unit. So they emphasize patriotism and the idea of a cohesive society, where despite kind of differences in class, regional background, citizens have more in common than what divides them. And this kind of champions a sense of national unity and shared purpose and kind of social harmony, with a focus on what unites rather than divides. As we spoke about previously, this is partly in order to refute socialism and their idea of class division and the threat that posed to hierarchy in the context of industrialization. The new right are very different. They very much reject an organic society and instead can be seen as promoting this idea of atomism within society. So their views on society differ a lot from traditional one-nation conservatives. For them, society is less of an organically involving entity shaped by traditions and kind of communal relationships, and it's actually just a collection of individuals pursuing their own interests. There's not much to say of society at all, and this is kind of brought together in this principle of atomism. So rather than emphasising the organic development of society and communal bonds, they focus on promoting individualism and ensuring and promoting freedom and ensuring that the state's role is minimised to prevent it from infringing upon individual freedom. And that can be seen in Rand's thought in The Virtue of Selfishness, where she argued the smallest minority on earth is the individual. Those who deny individual rights cannot claim to be defenders of minorities. As that really shows this kind of promotion of the individual is key to the new right. And they don't support the belief in organic society, that the society or state is as a whole is more important than its different parts. For the new right, individuals are the most important part, and that drives all of their political beliefs. So atomism is crucially this belief that society is made up of distinct, independent individuals, and this is very different to this emphasis on localism or this emphasis on a cohesive society or society as a whole. And as a result, they advocate for a minimal state that just leaves individuals alone. And as I mentioned, Thatcher once said in 1987, there is no such thing as society. There are individual men and women, and there are families. Okay, one of the final principles then we're going to look at is human imperfection. So human imperfection is a key principle of conservatism, and it argues that humans are flawed, which makes them incapable of making good decisions for themselves. It's linked in a bit into paternalism, as we looked at previously. And this kind of pessimistic interpretation is very different for liberals' far more optimistic interpretation that focuses on kind of humans as rational beings. So this idea, as we looked right at the start of the video, can first be seen in Hobbes' Leviathan, which sets out the belief that in the state of nature, in the absence of a strong state, human life would inevitably fall into a state of constant conflict and competition for resources and power. And he described it as it would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And this was due to his belief that humans are ruthless, calculating, and inherently driven by their basic interest, by their self-interest, which would lead them to conflicting with each other. And this kind of bleak outlook led to him supporting a strong central authority, the Leviathan, a strong state to impose order in society. And this was key kind of for influencing conservative beliefs. And they believed that human nature and human imperfection is a constant, and that politicians need to accommodate it rather than try and alter it. So, and this kind of can be really useful to break this kind of human imperfection down into three aspects. So you've got psychological imperfection. So they believe that humans are kind of influenced by their emotions, fears, and desires rather than rational thought. And they really, as a result, saw kind of traditions and guidance as important to guiding human nature, which kind of links into Burke's support for localism and for little platoons. They saw them as morally imperfect, so naturally inclined towards self-interest and potentially acting immorally, and also intellectually imperfect. Humans have limitations in their understanding and capacity to rationalise, and this links their kind of respect for tradition as well. They don't think that you should kind of try and design something perfect based on these ideological abstractions and these kind of ideas that kind of liberalism has. They think you should listen to tradition because tradition has a lot more wisdom than you do, right? Because humans are intellectually imperfect, they can't properly understand things, and therefore we should listen to the teachings of the past rather than trying to design and propose upheaval in society and design something new. And this is key to kind of shaping their other views in society. So it undermines the support for a strong but responsible state to provide kind of guidance, order, and security. Translates into kind of preference for the proven and traditional capitalist system over radical and untested theories in their economic views. And in society explains their real caution towards rapid social change and their preference for gradual organic development that respects tradition. In terms of strands of conservatism, human imperfection is really key to traditional conservatism. So it's influenced by Hobbes, who, as I said kind of at the start of the video, kind of actually preceded conservatism, but as he's included in the course, probably better to describe him as traditional conservative rather than anything else. Obviously, you can explain it, you can just potentially explain that he came before conservatism, but you also, I think it's fine to describe him as a traditional conservative as well. But in terms of Burke, kind of traditional conservative interpretation of human imperfection was deeply influenced by conservatism. So this idea of original sin and the kind of fallibility of man resulted in Burke advocating for the idea that humans need guidance and structure in society through these institutions and through these little platoons. And they also believe that this inherent human imperfection requires a stable hierarchical social order because people aren't necessarily equipped to make decisions by themselves based on reason. Therefore, they need this kind of authoritarian state, which we talked about when we looked at paternalism and hierarchy. But importantly, these kind of traditional conservatives, particularly Burke, aren't as pessimistic about human nature as Hobbes. So they believe that they can be mitigated through the influence of tradition and proper guidance. And this is crucial with kind of Burke's idea of little platoons, but also Oakeshott kind of described human behaviour as noisy, foolish, and flawed, which is kind of directly going against Hobbes, right, of nasty, brutish, and short. So it's this idea that while humans are fallible and often intellectually and psychologically imperfect, they make mistakes. When they're kind of framed by the right institutions, they can be kind of benign and benevolent, or human nature can be benign and benevolent, and human nature isn't inherently morally evil or kind of malevolent or destructive. And that's why they kind of place this real emphasis on tradition, institutions, little platoons to kind of give individuals guidance. In terms of one nation, conservatives' interpretation of human nature, largely consistent with that traditional conservatives, they recognise the inherent imperfections and recognise that individuals are driven by this mix of self-interest, emotions, and limited rationality. And this leads them to, this is kind of key to their justification for paternalism in governance. They believe that the state should act in a protective manner, as ultimately it knew better, and should therefore look after everyone in society. Ultimately, kind of one development is that they kind of also recognise that people need practical support in the economy, as can be seen with some of Disraeli's reforms. The new right really differs, and they really effectively reject human imperfection. So it's very different traditional one nation views on human nature. They don't see humans as imperfect. Instead, they see them as rational and self-interested, and they see that as a positive thing that creates the potential for self-governance and self-improvement. So very much influenced by these kind of classical liberal tradition and classical liberal beliefs rather than conservatism. So they believe that individuals are inherently driven to pursue their own goals and interests, and rather than seeing this in a negative light, they believe it's beneficial for society as a whole, and the state shouldn't get in the way of it. They therefore disagree with these kind of one nation and traditional conservative beliefs in paternalism and the idea that people need moral and intellectual guidance. And that fundamentally shapes their views on how the state and economy should operate, as well as their belief that society, or kind of, as well as the kind of being fundamental to their the understanding of society, is atomistic. So it leads them to support a limited role for the state in both the economy and social affairs. They argue that excessive state intervention not only undermines individual freedom, but also the efficient functioning of the market. And in their view, the state should exist only to protect individual rights, enforce contracts, and ensure national security, rather than redistributing wealth or providing a range of social services, which they believe is kind of really infringing on freedom. And this can be seen in two kind of elements of thought from Rand and Nozick. So Rand argued that self-interest not only benefited society, but was a moral imperative. In her philosophy of objectivism, she posited that pursuing one's happiness and interests is the highest moral pursuit, a viewpoint that fundamentally opposes this kind of idea of self-sacrifice for collective goals or paternalism. It's all about self-interest. So she opposed personal altruism, as kind of I spoke about earlier in the video, which she saw as kind of creating an unhealthy dependence in those who are the recipients, which shows a kind of lack of support for paternalism as well. And also important is Nozick's theory of self-ownership. So this asserts that individuals have sovereignty over their bodies and their rights, and as a result, they should be free to choose how they use their abilities and resources without coercive interference from the state. And he argued this is a key principle of justice, and this was key to kind of his real opposition to taxation, for example, because he believed this government intervention, where kind of this forcible taking of your money, was opposed to this self-ownership, and that individuals should be free to kind of choose how they use their abilities and resources without this coercive interference from the state. Okay, and the final key principle we're going to look at is the idea that the state should provide order and security. So this is a central kind of principle and tenet of conservative thought. So they believe that the primary function of the state is to provide and maintain social order and to ensure the security of its citizens rather than kind of seeking progressive utopian ends. So that's linked into this kind of pragmatism view of pragmatism as well. And this stems from their recognition of human imperfection and the need for structural authority to maintain relations and protect societal relations and protect individuals from harm. Crucially, this links back to Hobbes. We looked at him in Human Imperfection. This is actually a picture of Hobbes's Leviathan here, which is the state. So he believed that without a strong state, the kind of inherently self-interested nature of humans leads to chaos and disorder and ultimately civil war, effectively, in the context he was writing. And therefore, you need a strong state in order to kind of provide order and security, and once that state's set up, it shouldn't be questioned, which is where you can kind of potentially link that into traditional conservatism, their view of authority as well. They see the state as a guarantor of order, providing a framework within which individuals can live, work, and interact safely. And let's have a look at that now in the kind of strands of conservatism. So first, with traditional one-nation conservatism, they crucially support this idea of kind of the state providing order and security, and quite influenced by Hobbes. So they see that as its key kind of role as providing law and order to prevent a descent into chaos. An example of that they kind of see as kind of emphasis on law enforcement, a strong judicial system, important focus on defence, and that can really be seen in kind of traditional conservative reforms under Robert Peel in the 19th century, with the kind of establishment of a metropolitan police service, which is key to maintaining social stability, but also kind of reflects this idea of a cohesive society, an organic society, with kind of neighbourhood policing. It shouldn't just be done by force, but through kind of a shared understanding and these kind of shared principles and the kind of shared reflection of traditions and guidance, effectively. So kind of one of Peel's famous principles is the police are the public and the public are the police. And the New Right, crucially, also really do support this idea that the state provides order and security. So even though they kind of advocate for rolling back the state in economic affairs, they believe that kind of this needs to be done, like ultimately the market needs a secure environment and the state needs to provide order and security, even if it should be kind of much smaller in other affairs. They don't think the state should be big. They think there should be kind of one of the state's very limited roles. They do think it's very necessary. Rand, for example, wrote, "The only proper purpose for a state was to protect man's rights, which means protect him from physical violence." And neoconservatism in particular advocates for a strong state in defence and policing, arguing for kind of robust kind of national defence capabilities, effective law enforcement as kind of key components of national sovereignty and public safety. And yeah, the New Right really emphasised the state's kind of protective role in society. So while they kind of advocated for a reduced role in economic affairs, they didn't in terms of law and order. Okay, so I was very, very long now going through kind of all of the principles and some of the disagreements there. What I've done now is quickly, all the detail of these we've kind of already gone through, right? And is earlier in the video if you're just coming to this bit of the video now. But kind of summarise these for the state, economy, society, and human nature, some of these kind of key agreements and principles and some of the disagreements. So for the state, kind of key principles, this one we kind of just looked at, key kind of agreement between all the strands that the state should provide order and security in society. Whereas key tensions and disagreements is the kind of economic role in the state, so New Right support for libertarianism, especially contrasting with one nation conservatives' view, who recognise the importance of state intervention at points in kind of a pragmatic way. This also links into this final one here, the idea that the traditional one nation their beliefs about how the state should act are driven by pragmatism and tradition, whereas the New Right is very much driven by ideology and support for freedom. And crucially, another one is this kind of traditional one nation support for paternalism and hierarchy versus the New Right's rejection of paternalism and hierarchy. In terms of the economy, you've got kind of agreements and kind of support for capitalism and property rights, and acceptance of a significant degree of inequality in the economy. Again, key tension disagreements, kind of level of state intervention in the economy, the libertarianism versus one nation conservatism's belief in a paternalistic state in economic affairs. Traditional one nation conservatives believe in hierarchy, which is strongly rejected by the New Right. And crucially, the new right supports capitalism for very different reasons to one nation traditional conservatives. So they're not driven by pragmatism and tradition, they're driven by ideology and ideological support for freedom, which is kind of crucial to the idea that they're kind of actually, especially the neoliberal element of it, is kind of belongs a little bit more to a liberal tradition. In terms of society, again, that agreement is the acceptance of a significant degree of inequality, and all strands believing that order and security and property rights are crucial to a stable and successful society. Disagreements are kind of over on organic society versus the new right's belief in kind of atomism and individualism, whilst kind of traditional one nation believe in this organic cohesive society, and traditional with Burke's political platoons in particular in localism. Traditional one nation conservatives believe in paternalism and hierarchy, whilst the new right really rejects this. And the new right's view of society is driven by individual freedom, whilst traditional one nation are driven by pragmatism and tradition. In terms of human nature, agreement is that the state is needed to provide order and security. Without it, human nature would lead to conflict. The principle of human imperfection, here obviously the new right does reject it, but it's such a central principle of conservatism, I thought it's worth including in the key agreements of principles, because you might often include this in the kind of agreement paragraphs, and obviously explain the disagreements later on in the essay as well. But it's such a key principle, I think it's worth including it up here. Then obviously in human nature, it's this real belief in human imperfection for traditional one nation conservatives, but a rejection of this, pessimistic interpretation by the new right. And traditional one nation conservatives believe that paternalism, tradition, and little platoons are important, kind of guide human nature in the right direction, whereas the new right really rejects this and believes in individualism, and believes that intervention creates dependency and the individual should be left alone. So the final section I've got for this video is just a couple of overall examples of evaluation in relation to these conservatism as a whole, because I recognise that this is one of the most difficult parts of A-level politics. So I've got two interpretations here, and you can argue very much for either of them. You can be somewhere in the middle even potentially, but it shows you some of the different ways, and this is obviously for conservatism as a whole rather than if we're just looking at the state, economy, society, or human nature, but it gives you an idea of some of the ways of very high level A-star analysis of how you can argue for more disagreement than agreement, or vice versa. So in terms of the argument there's more disagreement than agreement, it's the idea that the new right in particular are very different from the rest of conservatives. They fundamentally reject the key beliefs and principles of conservatism that shape traditional one-nation views. So they're not driven by pragmatism, human imperfection, and tradition. They're fundamentally ideologically driven by the promotion of individualism and freedom. And that leads them to rejecting the kind of key principles of paternalism, organic society, and refer to themselves as true conservatives. The agreements they have with the other strands are limited, and they don't support them for the same reasons. They therefore have greatly different interpretation of conservatism that is in part founded to reject one-nation views. And it can also be noted that there are important differences between traditional and one-nation conservatives, particularly the one-nation conservatives in the 20th century. So one-nation conservatives' belief in paternalism is different to traditional conservatives' support for authority, and the extent of state interventions are kind of accepted in the 20th century by one-nation conservatives goes much further than what traditional conservatives arguably advocate for. On the other hand, it can be argued that there is significant agreement between conservatives. So this can be seen in particular traditional and one-nation conservatives. So though one-nation conservatives have some different views in relation to the economy and stronger support for paternalism, it can be argued that this is kind of really changing to conserve and reflects these kind of key principles of pragmatism and gradual change, and the recognition that you can't just not change at all. To conserve tradition and the principles of society, you need to change a bit and adapt to a new society. This is adaptation to industrialization. Further, they fundamentally agree in relation to kind of other key principles of pragmatism, tradition, organic society, hierarchy, capitalism, property rights, human imperfection, and the view that the state should provide order and security. And there are also important ways that the new right's views are consistent with those of earlier strands of conservatism. So they support capitalism and property. Neoconservatism place great emphasis on the state's role in providing order and security as well. You can also potentially bring in anti-permissiveness into that as well, with support for traditional values. It is, though, it's pretty undeniable that there are kind of clear differences between the new right's views and the principles of conservatism. But it could be argued this doesn't mean that there's more disagreement and agreement within conservatism, because it would be argued that the new right actually shouldn't be seen as conservatives at all. They should actually be seen as more of a reflection of a liberal tradition. Therefore, there are obviously naturally going to be key differences between those and conservatives, and that's because you could actually make the argument that they're not conservatives at all and shouldn't be considered conservatives. And you can see that in the key kind of classical liberal tradition in their beliefs on freedom, minimal state intervention, laissez-faire capitalism, and atomism. So yeah, they are quite complicated kind of arguments, but hopefully they should give you an idea of some of these kind of evaluations you could make and could potentially bring these into some of your essays to kind of really try and hit those higher marks. Okay, so in the final part of the video, we're going to have a look at the conservative thinkers. So they're the key ones named in the specification: Hobbes, Burke, Oakeshott, Rand, and Nozick, but also Disraeli, as I think Disraeli is really, really important. And you really need him effectively in your essays to support one nation conservatism, as none of these are one nation conservatives. We've gone through a lot of these ideas already earlier in the video, so some of these I'll go through relatively quickly. But yeah, feel free to pause and kind of read through them in a lot more detail if needed. So, in terms of the conservative thinkers, first one is Thomas Hobbes. As I kind of explained, in terms of a strand, he came before conservatism, as kind of conservatism really started with Burke in response to the French Revolution, which in relation to Hobbes came, God, can't be maths, but kind of 200 years later, since his birth at least, because kind of 100, 150 years later since he was writing. But if you kind of have to describe it as anything, so if you can't explain that or don't feel confident explaining that, and I think sometimes it's better when it's asking for a combination between kind of comparing strands, you can describe him as a traditional conservative. In terms of importance, he's not going to be relevant for every essay, but should definitely be brought in when talking about conservative views on human nature and the role of the state in providing order, particularly in those agreement paragraphs. So, as I said, he preceded the development of conservatism as an ideology, but his most important work, Leviathan, is key to kind of become very consistent with and inform the principles of conservatism, particularly in relation to human nature and the role of the state. So, key ideas. First one, we looked at this a lot throughout this video. This is the idea that in the absence of a strong state, so in the state of nature, life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short due to human nature. So Hobbes believed that humans are kind of ruthless, calculating, and naturally self-interested, which would lead them to kind of conflict in the state of nature, and therefore it would effectively be chaos and civil war. And as a result of that, he believed that a strong state was needed to provide order. So he thought that a strong state was necessary to prevent the chaos and conflict in the state of nature, and it's therefore necessary for individuals to give up some of their rights to the state so they can provide order and security. So the Leviathan, so the state he called the Leviathan, this kind of sovereign authority, should possess the power to enforce laws and maintain peace, therefore preventing the chaos of the state of nature. And this idea that strong governance is crucial to ensure societal stability and security kind of profoundly influenced later conservative thinkers, as did its kind of real emphasis on order, security, in the role of the state. Next key thinker, and is kind of the father of conservatism, and very much the key traditional conservative thinker, is Edmund Burke. It's very important, should definitely be brought in and mentioned in every essay in some way. Again, with these thinkers, it's worth noting that your essays on the ideology should be strand-driven rather than thinker-driven. That's why all of the previous notes were kind of really focused on the strand when looking kind of the agreements and the disagreements. But you should always think of these thinkers as examples to bring in. So one strand thinks this way, really explain that, and then bring in a thinker as an example. It shouldn't be starting with a thinker. It shouldn't be thinker-driven. It should very much be strand-driven first. So yeah, Wigan P. Edmund Burke, referred to as the father of conservatism, so founded conservative thought specifically in relation to the French Revolution. That's kind of spoke about at the start of the video, which upended the kind of traditional aristocratic and religious order in favour of the kind of liberal Enlightenment ideals. He strongly opposed this in his key text, Reflection of the Revolution in France, and kind of set out these key principles of conservatism, kind of traditions, social hierarchy, and gradual evolution. Key kind of first idea for him is tradition and empiricism. So really supported learning from and listening to tradition as a kind of accumulated wisdom of past societies. And he saw kind of tradition as this kind of key thread linking the past, present, and future. And its kind of key opposition to the French Revolution was partly due to this real disregard of the teaching of tradition. He very much had a cautious approach to change. He kind of, because of this kind of respect for tradition, he believed that it should be respected and change should be very organic and gradual, respecting and maintaining this tradition rather than through radical upheaval and this kind of real idea of kind of organic change. But he did also support this idea of changing to conserve, saying that a state without the means of some change is without the means of conservation. Emphasizing that you sometimes need to change. Change should be gradual and careful, but sometimes you need to do it in order to maintain tradition and prevent revolution effectively, and prevent upheaval in society. And then what kind of a final one I've kind of added, we looked at this in a lot more detail earlier, is this kind of idea of human imperfection, localism, and little platoons. So Burke saw humans as very much imperfect and was very influenced by Christianity in this view, this idea of original sin. But he really believed in the kind of importance of guidance and traditions in society, and little platoons. He talked about these kind of smaller little communities and groups in society in guiding human nature in the right way. Okay, next thinker, as I mentioned, this one not named on the specification, but one I think is really important, is Benjamin Disraeli. So he's a one nation conservative, and despite not being a named thinker, he's a kind of, in a way, the key thinker for one nation conservatism, and should be used in most essays as a key example of their views. So he was Conservative Prime Minister in the mid to late and leader in the mid to late 19th century, and kind of really was quite important to the kind of articulation and implementation of one nation conservatism as a kind of adaptation and gradual reform of traditional conservatism to a changing society. Key ideas, first one is kind of paternalism and noblesse oblige, which again, we've looked at all of these kind of earlier in the video, but this is kind of the idea that the state is the kind of responsibility of the state and the upper classes to safeguard and look after the welfare of those less privileged in society. And this came into this idea of noblesse oblige, which is effectively like the obligation of nobles to look after those in lower positions in society and act with generosity and responsibility towards them. And that led him to kind of support the kind of idea of a state as like a benevolent guardian who's to kind of taking care of the welfare of the less privileged in society, and see that in some of the kind of social reforms that his government enacted. Crucially, this was not just philosophical, it was also very much strategic. It was kind of one of his key phrases, the palace is not safe when the cottage is not happy. So it's also to kind of, by supporting those lower down in society, you kind of warded them off, or present this idea of society where they didn't need to support socialism and really support revolution, support upheaval, which is obviously key to tradition and stability and maintaining society as well. And crucially, this idea of kind of why it's called one nation conservatism was kind of quite important as an idea of Disraeli as well. He really supported the idea of a cohesive society and promoting the idea that everyone's together in one cohesive unit in one nation, and that kind of we have more in common than divides us. So kind of really countering these class divisions that were being stoked by socialist ideologies. So there's a real promotion of a sense of shared national identity to kind of bridge the growing divide between the classes. And he supported to kind of promote and romanticize the empire in the public imagination as part of this, for example, with the Suez Canal. So next thinker is Michael Oakeshott. As I kind of mentioned earlier in the video, he's sometimes described as a one nation conservative, but he kind of very much described himself as a traditional, and I think he's a lot more consistent with traditional conservative views, even if he came later. It was almost a restatement of traditional conservative views in the early 20th century. And you see this kind of the key views, pragmatism. So he saw in the 20th century a lot of kind of extreme politics on the left and right being driven by utopianism and these ideas of a perfect society, and driven by this kind of theory and utopianism and theoretical abstraction. And he advocated for a real return to pragmatism in politics, and that's how you should listen to tradition, advocating for gradual change rather than this idealism. And you kind of, as we discussed earlier, he's got this kind of analogy of the boat, some really good quotes that you can use to kind of illustrate this. And again, a real belief in human imperfection that he kind of recentered in the 20th century. That humans aren't, it's linked into this kind of pragmatism. Humans aren't perfect, can't design these kind of they're intellectually imperfect, so they can't design these perfect systems. And he supported the view that human imperfection was a constant that politicians should seek to accommodate it. But crucially, it was a bit of a move away from kind of Hobbes, and it was kind of a traditional conservative, but a bit less imperfect than Hobbes. So he didn't think it kind of nasty, brutish, and short. He thought life would be noisy, foolish, and flawed. It was kind of very much a direct move, kind of reference to Hobbes there in how he's writing. And kind of real suggesting that humans are fallible and often intellectually and psychologically imperfect, so a belief in human imperfection, but they're not inherently morally evil, malevolent, or destructive. And kind of, I suppose, consistent with the traditional conservative view of Burke in terms of the idea of guidance in shaping humans in the right direction. The first new right thinker, then, very much kind of a neoliberal, as is Nozick actually, is Ayn Rand. So I forgot to mention in terms of the importance for Oakeshott, kind of, I think it's definitely important as well, and you can bring him into a lot of essays. He's got kind of a lot to say, and you can apply it to lots of different things. Ayn Rand also very important. You definitely try and bring her and Nozick into to definitely one of her and Nozick to support the new right in each essay, and potentially both if you can as well. She's a Russian-American novelist who is a key figure in advocating for neoliberalism and the new right. So she was born in Russia, saw the kind of consequences of the Soviet Union, the Bolshevik Revolution, and then came to the United States and really strongly advocated for individualism, free market capitalism, and freedom. And a lot of these principles are articulated in novels, actually, such as Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead. Key ideas. So first one we kind of looked at a little bit already is objectivism. We looked at this earlier in the video. This is kind of the idea that the pursuit of one's own happiness and of one's kind of rational self-interest is the highest moral pursuit. It's not just kind of pragmatic or the most kind of effective for the economy. She saw it as kind of there's a real moral justification for this, and she kind of, as I've talked about a couple of times in the video, really opposed personal altruism as a result of this, because she thought it created dependency in those who were supported. Actually, the more moral thing was to follow your own self-interest and support yourself. And she's to kind of support this in this quote here in The Virtue of Selfishness, where she said, "The man who attempts to live for others is a dependent. He is a parasite in motive and makes parasites of those he serves." And she also crucially supported freedom and laissez-faire capitalism. So she was really driven by promoting freedom and individualism in society, really showing the kind of neoliberalism and her inheritance of kind of more of actually a liberal tradition and classical liberal thought, which kind of spoke about kind of in the middle of the video in terms of whether neoliberals should be considered conservatives at all. Yeah, she believed that freedom in personal and economic realms is necessary for individuals to act on their rational judgment and achieve their potential. And as a result, she believed in laissez-faire capitalism as the most efficient economic system to promote this. And argued that the state's role should be limited to just kind of promoting individual rights so that individuals can flourish in the economy, especially under free market capitalism. Robert Nozick, again, neoliberal, the new right, kind of held very similar views, and kind of, I suppose we can bring in a couple of different kind of specific ideas of his, and this first one was kind of really the idea of libertarianism. It's kind of really kind of free market, effectively, a justification for real free market economics, and this is justified in the idea that individual rights should really be respected by the state, and that humans should be treated as an end, not a means to an end at any point. And therefore, he thought that the state's role should be minimal, very limited to protecting individuals from force, threat, and fraud, and enforcing contracts, rather than kind of any redistribution or significant state role. And he ultimately said the minimal state is the most extensive state that can be justified, as any state more extensive violates people's individual rights. And crucially, anything more extensive, especially what he's talking about, was kind of redistributive taxation, excessive kind of social welfare, which he saw effectively as forced labour. He saw taxation on earnings as forced labour, because effectively it is taken with the threat of force. And finally, kind of his key view was the idea of self-ownership. It's the idea that individuals have sovereignty over their bodies and the fruits of their labour, and therefore they should be free to choose how they use them without being interfered with, especially by the state. And that kind of really underlined his key his and the New Right's key opposition to redistributive policies, as they were seen as infringing upon personal liberty and property rights. Therefore, any kind of respecting self-ownership means that any exchange or transfer of property must be voluntary, based on free consent, rather than kind of based on force. And ultimately wrote in Anti-State Utopia, which is kind of his key text, individuals have rights, and there are no things that no person or group may do to them without violating their rights. So yeah, really long video. I hope that you kind of can skip between lots of different parts of it at different points of your revision, and it will really help you out in the A-levels this year and for people in years to come as well. If you've got any questions or comments, let them put them in the comment section below, and I'll get back to you. And as I said, this PDF, the PDFs in this video, as well as ones for liberalism and socialism, you can find in the first link in the description to the Politics Explained website, where you can also find loads and loads of resources to help you out in the A-level, with detailed essay plans for UK politics, UK government, also these ideologies, also US politics. I've kind of written a textbook, and soon we'll be bringing out essay plans as well, and 12 marker plans, as well as a place to sign up for tutoring if that's something you'd be interested in, to get a bit more kind of detailed, tailored support with the A-level from tutors who have done it recently, who have got an A-star, and who can really help you kind of on an individual level with both essay writing and the content. So yeah, thank you very much.